Hi, my name is Damien Hardacre and I'm a chemistry teacher at Bucksburn Academy in Aberdeen. I recently gave this brief presentation during a staff meeting to my colleagues and it was quite well received, and subsequently I've been asked to record this in the hope that some of you will also find it quite useful. So it's going to cover two aspects of evidence-based teaching: retrieval practice and also the spacing effect, both the theory and how we can use it in our classrooms. So if you're not familiar with evidence-based teaching, I can highly recommend you investigate it a little bit further. I came across it 2 years ago and I think I've made more progress as a teacher in the last 2 years than in the previous 7 or 8 combined. So I've included some links at the end of the PowerPoint and I believe that it's going to be made available to you all. So retrieval practice and spacing, theory and use in class. So retrieval practice. I'll just give you a few seconds to have a read of this here. So retrieval practice is the research-backed premise that when pupils are tested regularly, they make more progress than if not, and that's shown in the following graph. So in this study, 3 groups of pupils were set study programs, some of which were purely rereading their notes, and some had more elements of testing, and the results show clearly that the pupils that were tested more often produced higher test scores. So the pupils who were in the blue category, they had much more testing compared to the pupils in the red category, which were purely rereading their notes. And interestingly, this went against pupil self-assessment of the effectiveness of testing versus rereading their notes, as shown in the following graph. So this here is after the test had been completed. After the exam had been completed, pupils were asked, did it help me? And the majority of them felt that if they just reread their notes, that was the most beneficial way to test them, to revise. So the authors theorised that when a pupil reads their notes as it's familiar, they convince themselves that they know the materials. And this is something that I show my pupils. This graph is something that I show my pupils when we're discussing study strategies. So then the question becomes, what are effective ways to test? So one of the ways that we incorporate retrieval practice into our lessons in the chemistry department is by combining it with the something known as the spacing effect, which is the following. So I'll just give you a second or two to have a quick read of this. And the spacing effect is demonstrated in something called the forgetting curve, which shows us that once learning has first occurred, a high percentage of it is quickly lost and not moved to long-term memory. And I've no doubt that you've seen this in your classrooms. You can teach something well, pupils can answer really tough questions on it, and then some weeks later you maybe revisit it and it's like they've never seen it before. So we need to keep revisiting the materials again and again and again to embed it into long-term memory. And if we do so, then it will take longer for that material to be forgotten. So in this here, we are reviewing the materials, and it takes a little bit longer for the time for it to be forgotten, and review it again, it takes even longer, and so on and so on and so on. So how can we actually use this in class? Well, the way that we do it in the chemistry department is we combine both retrieval practice and spacing into both our formative and summative assessments. And this works particularly well with S3 onwards. And our lesson starters are essentially low stakes tests that pupils complete each lesson. So our lesson starters would be our formative assessments, and then our class tests, our summative assessments, we also introduce the spacing effect there. And one way we do for our lesson starters is we use something called last week, last term, last month. And this is a 3 past paper questions, approximately 10 to 15 minutes long. And the idea is that with each question, we're not just assessing materials that we've done recently, we are assessing materials that we have done previously. So last week would be something that we've done recently, and that may tie into the lesson that we're about to do. Last month may do the same, it may tie into the lesson we're about to complete, but maybe last term is completely, it doesn't relate to what we're doing immediately. But the idea is that you'll keep coming back again and again and again to materials that you haven't done for a while in the attempt to embed this into long-term memory. And having spoken to my pupils about this, they find this to be quite beneficial, and I've got a little bit of feedback from them later on. But really, there are as many ways to do retrieval practice as a starter as there are starters. So this is kind of a similar sort of idea, just a different format. I picked this up off Twitter, which is great if you're not already on there for educational materials. In this one here, we have a series of questions, and if the pupils pick the purple questions, they get 4 points because that's from a long time ago. If they pick a bluey, green, turquoisey colour, then they only get 1 point because it's quite recent, so it should be familiar to them. But one thing's important about using this as a starter is that it has to be a test, so the pupils cannot check their notes for it, because again, if they check their notes, then that's not testing themselves. They have to drag this from the recesses of their brain and get it down onto paper. And maybe they won't be successful in one particular lesson, but if you come back to this again and again and again, they'll be more successful in the future. So there's multiple ways of doing this. We've also got things such as maybe a 5-minute mind map. You could get your pupils to write the quiz, flashcards, knowledge organisers. Basically, any way that you do your starters, you can incorporate retrieval practice if provided you are testing them on materials that they have done not just recently, but also quite a long time ago. So we also use space testing in the chemistry department. Previously, traditionally we've taught topics, and then following that, immediately pupils will be given a test. And the two main tests that we have key area tests, and then we have end of topic tests. But what we do now is we actually space out when the tests are. So we would teach a topic, and then we would not test them for a while. So we stagger the tests throughout the year, and we also, on an average of a month after the topics have actually been taught, we would then come back and test it. And the idea is that the pupils are having to review their materials all the way throughout the years by combining both retrieval practice and also the space testing. What we found is, and I know this is very far from being robust data, but I had a look at my prelim results for the last academic year, so 2019-20, and my prelim results over the last 5 years have been there or thereabouts the same. And this year, the only real difference that I made was the two things, space testing and also retrieval practices as a starter. And what we found is that both for the National 5 and for the higher classes, we've got an 8% increase as an average across the class. Now, whether that would have translated itself into the final exams, we'll never know because of the situation, the pandemic, but it's going to be continued, and we hope it will be in the future. And the pupils, I asked them, I said, does this help you? Do you like this? Do you want to keep it? And overwhelmingly they said yes. They said it's a very beneficial way to revise continually throughout the year. One pupil going so far as to say it's the only time that we actually do revision. So in summary, repeated testing improves retention of information, and space testing, both formative and summatively, is an effective way of ensuring that materials are moved into long-term memory, which is obviously what we want to improve the retention of information. So there are some useful links here, and as I said at the beginning, I believe that this is going to be forwarded to you, the PowerPoint. I would highly recommend that you have a look at certainly the top one there, Research Ed. I went to one of their CPD sessions in Glasgow a while back, and it was absolutely brilliant. The rest of them are very useful though as well. And if any of you guys have got any questions or you want any further information about this, I'm very far from an expert on it, but I certainly could answer any questions to the best of my abilities. Just drop me an email. I'm more than happy to do so. So thank you for listening, and I hope that you got a little bit from this.